A little while ago, I heard incredible news that my home, British Columbia, in Canada, had received 400 truly amazing Neolithic and Bronze Age artifacts from where else but Britain, as part of a traveling exhibit about the world's most famous and enigmatic megalithic monument, Stonehenge. I was also delighted to learn that it features the burial goods of the famous Amesbury Archer, who I actually mentioned in part 2 of the Ancient Civilizations Iceberg, because he's the most famous representative of the Beaker culture, the people who brought Indo-European steppe DNA into Western Europe and became the ancestors of all modern Western Europeans. But I live on BC's mainland, while the traveling exhibit is being held in the Royal BC Museum in BC's grand old imperial capital, Victoria, which is on an island, Vancouver Island, which is only accessible by ferry. So my family and I decided to go and spend a weekend there to check the exhibit out, and to see some of the other prehistoric and natural curiosities Victoria has to offer. And I definitely wasn't disappointed by what I found. But this isn't actually a travelogue. Since I know how much you guys love them, I've created an iceberg dedicated to Stonehenge, which I'll be referring to throughout the video. Before I left, I was really surprised to find that there's barely any footage of this exhibit online, even though it's already been to Denver and Houston. So right as I was leaving, I decided to ask you guys if you wanted to see the objects in the exhibit as much as I did, and since your response was overwhelmingly positive, here's what I got to see at Stonehenge, the exhibit. The entrance to the exhibit was fittingly a giant mock-up of Stonehenge, and right beyond that was a black and white illustration of it being built. Similar illustrations depicting the people connected to Stonehenge are scattered all across the exhibit, and they're pretty cool. I wish I got the name of the artist. There was also this little scale diorama of Stonehenge, and there are similar dioramas depicting each stage of Stonehenge's development throughout the galleries. But the first actual artifact you see upon entering the actual gallery is a deer antler pick from the 4th millennium BC. There are tons more scattered throughout the exhibit. Before seeing all these, I had no idea how important a tool these were for the Neolithic farmers who built Stonehenge, and it seems like they used absolutely huge quantities of them to dig out the ditches that surrounded their henges. It even featured a diorama of a guy swinging one like a pickaxe. At first I had no clue how they would have been acquired in such huge amounts, but apparently they're mostly from what deer shed in the fall. Except in Stonehenge's case for some reason, because the people who dug its ditch used the antlers of deer killed while still wearing them. Seen here, which I'm sure PETA definitely wouldn't approve of. Maybe they'll be the next ones to vandalize Stonehenge. The builders of Stonehenge's ditch used over 70 because even though they're relatively sturdy, they wore down pretty quickly and might have become unusable after only a single day of work. Antler Picks is in level 2 of the iceberg. Right next to that first antler pick was one of the most fascinating Stone Age tools in the entire exhibit. A finely polished jadeite axe taken from high up in the Alps, and then brought all the way to Britain by some of the earliest Neolithic farmers to get there, possibly centuries after its initial creation, and maybe as an heirloom of their continental ancestors. The stone in this axe was found in the foothills of Monte Viso in northern Italy, and wound up at a place called Nether Cerne in Dorset, which seems to feature some Neolithic long barrows. This is one of around 70 known axes like this, and they were clearly important. They don't show any signs of wear, and they seem to have been deposited at special places, likely as offerings of some kind. These fascinating, continent-spanning jadeite axes are in the bottom of level 3 of the iceberg. But you know what else is as reliable and hard to crack as this stone axe? The sponsor of this video, Private Internet Access VPN. It's the most reliable, transparent, and easy to use VPN app around. A VPN, or Virtual Private Network, is an app that's able to hide your IP address and shields your internet connection and private information through an encrypted tunnel, stopping the many people willing to exploit it from doing so, which you're most at risk of when you connect to public Wi-Fi networks. But Private Internet Access, which is available on all platforms, protects your personal data by encrypting your internet connection through their world-class server infrastructure, making your valuable personal information entirely off limits. Private Internet Access also happens to be the world's most transparent VPN provider, and it never records or stores its users' data. But my favorite feature of PIA is that it also allows you to access region-restricted content from all over the world, because it works with all major streaming services and connects to servers in 91 different countries. Because I've been obsessing over British prehistory for the past few weeks, I wanted to check out British Netflix, and so I did, with no problems at all. Turns out they have some pretty good shows. So join the 30 million people like me who use private internet access today, which you can do in seconds with the link in the description below. Using that link, you can get it for 83% off, so it'll only cost you $2.03 a month. And on top of that, you'll get 4 months of free service completely for free. And on top of that, getting a single subscription allows you to protect an unlimited number of devices simultaneously. And even if it somehow doesn't suit you, there's a 30-day money-back guarantee and 24/7 customer support. But now let's return to the mysterious depths of prehistory. Just a stone's throw away, there was a really interesting case showcasing stone tools found at a site just 2 kilometers from Stonehenge, but far older than it, named Blick Mead, dated to between 8,000 and 4,000 BC. It lies next to an ancient spring and was home to Mesolithic or Middle Stone Age hunter-gatherers who would ultimately be replaced by farmers from the continent with their shiny jade axes in the Neolithic or New Stone Age around 4,000 BC, give or take. It's a bit more complicated than that. But this case does a great job at showing every possible stage of a Mesolithic flint tool's life, including their final form as thin, delicate little microliths, in sharp contrast with the squatter, chunkier tools of the Neolithic exhibited nearby. It seems like there's a lot of stone in this case, and there is, but it's just a drop in the bucket of what's been found at Blick Mead, because some 35,000 pieces of often burnt worked flint have been found there, along with 2,420 animal bones, including lots belonging to an ancient form of cattle known as the aurochs, some of which are displayed nearby. So it's likely that some pretty huge hunter-gatherer feasts were held there. Anyways, Neolithic farmers from the continent replaced those guys at Blick Mead quite literally, because Blick Mead is one of the latest Mesolithic sites in England. Those farmers then went on to build Stonehenge, but it's possible that Stonehenge's location was significant even among the hunter-gatherers they replaced. They're thought to be responsible for the huge post holes, which once held massive, possibly totem pole-esque wooden posts in place as far back as 8,500 years ago, which are now covered by Stonehenge's parking lot. It's possible that they took interest in the area because compared to the rest of southern England, it was a relatively open landscape consisting of chalk with a thin covering of turf, while most of the rest of southern England and the Mesolithic was covered in woodland, as suggested by analysis of sediments and pollen. So that's what Mesolithic Stonehenge in level 3 is referring to. A bit to the left, there were some surprisingly massive Mesolithic adzes, which are like axes but horizontal, which would have probably been used to cut down trees. Thank goodness for chainsaws. Imagine trying to cut down a tree with this. In addition to some more cute little microliths, there were these strange so-called pebble hammers, which might have been used as weights on the ends of digging sticks used to uproot edible plants. They're also called pebble maces, though, so as the name implies, maybe they were used to bash people's skulls in. They do look a lot like other maces from around the world. They could have also been used as symbols of status, fishing sinkers, or even as bolus stones. Who knows? Right behind these were some of the many different remains of a so-called mega feast that were found in a pit at a site named Coneybury Hill in 1980. As you can see, the artifacts are overlain on a diagram of where exactly they were actually found, which was pretty cool. It was dubbed the Coneybury Anomaly, which would be a great name for an out-of-place artifact, and dates to sometime in the 38th century BC. These are the earliest traces of the Neolithic farmers found near Stonehenge. Apparently Stonehenge is even visible from it. This includes the bones of enough cows, pigs, wild red and roe deer, and even beavers to feed over 1,000 people, supposedly. Since no other Neolithic site contains the proportion of wild deer found here, it's possible that they were actually brought to the feast by some of Britain's last remaining hunter-gatherers, which is sort of reminiscent of how the old hunter-gatherer populations of other places in Europe like Denmark and Holland coexisted with nearby farmers for centuries. There were also fragments of cooking pots, typical of southern England at the time, and apparently resembling ones found in Normandy, along with stone tools, including scrapers for skinning animals, and arrowheads, some of which might have been contributed by the hunter-gatherers. Coneybury was also later the site of its very own henge, so it's a very interesting spot. So that's what the Coneybury Anomaly in Level 2 is all about. And then, after you round a corner, you come upon the main stars of the show. Objects actually from Stonehenge and the sites intimately connected with it. That includes the places where the various stones of Stonehenge actually come from. One of those places is called Carn Goedog, which is one of multiple rocky outcrops in the Preseli Hills of southwest Wales identified as being where most of the so-called Bluestones at Stonehenge come from. These aren't the big Sarsen trilithons you think of when you think of Stonehenge though, those come from considerably closer. But the Bluestones are still incredibly important to Stonehenge's makeup, and they're pretty hefty themselves at around 4 tons each. 2 Bluestones from Carn Goedog are in this exhibit, but for some reason the first one didn't really look blue at all, which I was really disappointed by, but the second one was really blue, and it made me finally understand the Bluestone moniker. There were also some mudstone wedges from Carn Goedog. I really like the one that looks like a big wedge of cheese. They were likely hammered into the cracks between bluestone pillars to break them away from the rock face. Oddly, this mudstone is softer than the spotted dolerite of Carn Goedog, so maybe they were chosen to prevent unwanted cracks in the rock. The Bluestones were erected at Stonehenge much earlier than the Sarsens, in the 1st century of the 3rd millennium BC, during the first stage of its development. And since they're from Wales, they come from between 275 and 320 kilometers away, making Stonehenge the only stone circle in Britain to be built of such distantly sourced materials. As such, there's been a lot of debate about how exactly these Welsh Bluestones got there. Some people think they were carried by glaciers way back in the Ice Age, but I think the main consensus now is that it was done by people via a sea route or maybe by land. They might have even been magically lifted by Merlin. Well, probably not, but that's pretty close to what the 12th century writer Geoffrey of Monmouth claimed. He also claimed that Stonehenge was built to memorialize some Britons treacherously murdered by the Saxons in the 5th century AD, because at Merlin's suggestion it was stolen from a mountaintop all the way in Ireland, where it had been originally erected by giants, who themselves took the stones all the way from Africa. So why am I telling you all this? Well, the main curator of the exhibit, Professor Mike Parker Pearson, has theorized that this story might be a weird echo of how Stonehenge's actual builders may have acquired the Bluestones by dismantling a previously built stone circle at a location in the Preseli Hills called Wan Mon, right next to Carn Goedog. That part of Wales was ruled by Irish kings in the Dark Ages, so maybe that's what Geoffrey of Monmouth was referring to. There was also a genetic and cultural difference between the people of Wales and of southern England as far back as the Neolithic, oddly enough, so maybe the erection of the Bluestones at Stonehenge on the border between them did have to do with some long-forgotten conflict or resolution between them, which may have resulted from the general decline and isolation the British Isles were experiencing at the time. It's an interesting theory, and it was presented in the exhibit, but honestly, who knows? And also, that stone circle at Wan Mon was never itself completed. And it's right at the top of Level 3. It's also why I chucked Merlin in here. Anyways, there was also a Sarsen, which was pretty cool. 50 of the 52 of the big Sarsen stones at Stonehenge, including all the ones in the innermost horseshoe, likely come from a place 24 kilometers or 15 miles to the north of it, called Westwoods, on the edge of the town of Marlborough. I also got to see several of the big hammerstones used on the Sarsens, which are themselves made of quartzite sarsen, which is harder than the so-called sugar sarsen used at Stonehenge. These examples are also so big that they probably couldn't have been held by anybody, so it's been theorized that they were put in some kind of sling. So that's what big hammerstones in Level 2 is referring to. But ultimately, these are just a few of the roughly 10,000 total hammerstones used in Stonehenge's construction, which took an estimated 30 million hours of work in total to complete. That sounds incomprehensibly huge, but that's only, air quotes, 5,000 people working for 2 years. There were also some bluestone chippings, which isn't just refuse from their shaping, but also from their partial demolition during the Bronze Age. But speaking of the actual people who built Stonehenge, beyond the finds from Stonehenge itself, there are some finds from the site of a village and massive henge structure nearby that seems to be closely connected with it, called Durrington Walls. I had heard of Durrington Walls before, but I didn't really know what it was or how significant it was until I was face to face with the objects unearthed there, which might have been left by the workers who built Stonehenge. Durrington Walls is a pretty strange place. For roughly 10 to 12 years between 2500 and 2460 BC, so around when Stonehenge was being built, it was briefly the site of a village. So maybe it was inhabited for just as long as it took to build Stonehenge. Some of the many animals barbecued there also came from as far north as Scotland, believe it or not, and it's thought that it had enough room to accommodate 4,000 people, so it was a pretty big deal. The huge henge bank that gives the site its name was built over the remnants of that village by 2450 BC. But after it was a village and before the construction of the henge, it was the site of something called a palisaded enclosure, consisting of a ring of 300 huge, evenly spaced wooden posts, up to 5 meters high, which was itself replaced by something called the Southern Timber Circle shortly afterwards. There was also another structure, creatively called Woodhenge, immediately south of Durrington Walls, which was probably a part of the same complex before the henge was built, which might have maybe had a roof. I'm telling you all this because the exhibit presents the theory that both Stonehenge and Durrington Walls were part of the same religious complex, but that Durrington Walls represented the domain of the living, while Stonehenge acted as the domain of dead ancestors. The stretch of the River Avon between the two would have probably represented the transition between life and death. This theory also sort of entails that everyone from around Britain would have gotten together to celebrate huge festivals of the dead around these monuments. Probably during midwinter, because both Durrington Walls and Stonehenge were entered through paths aligned with the winter solstice. There's some more evidence backing this up. Durrington Walls and Woodhenge saw lots of feasting, as evidenced by all the pig and cattle bones and objects of daily life found there. That includes these nice bone cloak pins, beads, arrows, and flints. On the other hand, Stonehenge was mainly left as a building site and cemetery. There's also the fact that the structures around Durrington Walls were made of perishable wood, while Stonehenge is obviously made of stone. Like the ancient Egyptians, the Neolithic peoples of Britain seem to have lived in perishable temporary structures and only really used stone to build monuments to their dead, and in the ancient Egyptians' case, their gods. I think it's a cool theory, but I don't know if it's a fact. I think we'll ever truly know how exactly these structures were meant to be used. But my favorite objects from Durrington Walls have to be these fragments of a special type of pottery known as grooved ware. I first learnt about it the night before I left for Victoria, so I was sort of psyched to see them. They originated all the way up on the Scottish island of Orkney, itself home to some truly amazing Neolithic megaliths. And they developed this unique pottery style around 3200 BC. They're covered in beautiful textured designs imitating baskets. They're also noticeably the first flat-bottomed vessels to be used in the British Isles. Everything before them had rounded bases and couldn't stand on flat surfaces, which kind of defeats the point of having vessels in the first place. Plus, I also saw some pretty weird finds from Woodhenge, like these wild cat bones and sea urchin fossils dumped into a post hole. So that should explain Durrington Walls, grooved ware, and of course, Woodhenge sea urchins in level 4. And right beyond these was the Beaker Gallery. This final wing of the exhibit was probably the most significant of them all. In case you don't know, somehow the Indo-European Beaker folk descended from horse and wagon-mounted herders on the Pontic steppe rapidly and almost completely replaced Western Europe's early Stone Age farmers, the people who largely built Stonehenge. I spent a huge chunk of part 2 of the Forgotten Ancient Civilizations Iceberg talking about them, and about a lot of the objects I saw in person for the first time in this gallery. I often wonder what role the Beaker folk played in Stonehenge's construction, because the great Sarsen Stones, which define Stonehenge, were erected around 2500 BC, right when the Beaker folk were beginning their takeover of the British Isles, which I think is one of the most important events in history, because everyone from Great Britain and Ireland probably wouldn't exist without it happening, since that Beaker steppe DNA has persisted ever since. Some truly incredible artifacts were flanking the entrance to this gallery. that killed the famous and mysterious Stonehenge Archer, which had been mentioned in some of the relatively sparse advertising the exhibit got. The Stonehenge Archer is a man who was between 25 to 30 when he died and who was found buried in the northern part of the ditch that encircles Stonehenge back in 1978. Since he lived around 2300 BC, or anywhere between 2400 and 2140 BC, he's the very last of the roughly 240 people known to have been buried at Stonehenge. He was only found with a few objects, but they tell quite a dramatic story. The only thing he wore was a stone archer's wrist guard, typical of the Beaker folk, hence his name, and the 3 flint arrowheads found around his chest that had killed him. 4 arrows were probably shot into him from behind at long and close range from at least 3 different directions. One probably hit his heart because either its broken off tip or a market left was found in his sternum. Sources differ. But that arrowhead had actually been largely pulled out, even though the other 3 shown here had been left in his body. No one knows what led up to this. The plaque at the exhibit theorizes that he could be a human sacrifice, an executed criminal, or even the target of an assassination. Likely human sacrifices have also been found at the Beaker ritual site of Pamelt in central Germany, which is incredibly similar to Stonehenge, so maybe this is connected to that. It's also possible that he was killed in battle, or even that he's a murder victim whose body was deliberately hidden in the ditch by his murderers. Maybe because an impromptu grave anywhere else in the chalky landscape of Stonehenge would leave a suspicious white patch. The Stonehenge Archer is at the bottom of level 2. Next, there was this pretty typical Beaker man's burial assemblage found at a place called Roundway Down, 9 miles north of Stonehenge, all the way back in 1855. It features a nice little beaker and archer's wrist guard similar to the one worn by the Stonehenge Archer but made of jadeite from as far afield as Spain, a stone arrowhead, and a pretty imposing copper dagger blade that was likely made all the way in Central Europe. The owner of these objects has come to be known as the Roundway Archer. He's at the bottom of level 3 on the iceberg. Scientific analysis of his bones suggests that he was brought up locally, but he was certainly in touch with his Beaker brethren on the continent. It's also just a really neat display of how stone tools continued to be used with metal for a while. The artifacts in this case come from a large round barrow just northwest of Stonehenge called Amesbury G54, which dates to between 2300 and 1800 BC and contained 2 people, a man and a woman. The beaker, which is decorated with hundreds of fingernail impressions, the flint dagger, and this hammer used in metalworking were buried at the man's feet, and these amber and faience beads were found with the woman. The presence of these faience beads really struck me at the time because faience is a material most associated with ancient Egypt. And yet, these are only 2 of the 350 faience beads that have been found in Britain and Ireland, over half of which come from around Stonehenge, like these. The presence of such beads in Britain has inspired a lot of debate over the years about their origins, but it's likely that they're actually indigenous products, as suggested by the fact that British faience uniquely has tin in it. But some other faience beads found in Bronze Age graves in Denmark are definitely Egyptian, so you can't help but wonder how these 2 different types of faience were connected. And just this March, news that a faience bead was recovered from Must Farm near Peterborough was released. It's the latest of its kind in Britain because Must Farm dates to around 850 BC, and there's already speculation that it is actually Egyptian, which makes sense since it was found next to 48 glass beads, probably from Iran. Due to their sheer mysteriousness, I've put British faience in the 4th and final level of the iceberg. But then I finally encountered the burial goods of the Amesbury Archer. I've heard so many people talk about the very objects in front of me over years, and I've talked about them myself, so it was really great to finally see them in person. He was roughly contemporary with the other Beaker burials we've talked about, since he lived between 2400 and 2200 BC. His burial was discovered at the very end of an excavation season at a Roman cemetery in Amesbury, 3 miles southeast of Stonehenge in 2002. It turned out to be the richest Beaker burial in all of Britain, with 10 times more stuff in it than what's usually found in the others. I mean, just look at how much stuff is in this case compared to the others. It contained about 100 objects, including 3 copper knives, stone scrapers, 2 beautiful stone wrist guards, 16 flint arrowheads, 5 beakers, 3 of which were on display. This nice shale belt ring, objects made of antler like a pin, a cushion stone used like a mini anvil for metalworking, and even some gold. This is the earliest gold yet found in Britain. They've been called basket earrings, but they're probably little tresses for the Amesbury Archer's beard hairs. It's sort of funny to think that these little beard ornaments are sort of the ultimate precursors to the crown. So it's pretty clear that the Amesbury Archer was important, but he was so important that one of his immediate descendants, possibly his son, chose to be buried right next to him wearing similar golden hair tresses. And like the Boscombe bowman found nearby, analysis of his teeth enamel seems to indicate that he grew up on the continent, specifically around the Alps, but the guy next to him seems to have grown up in England. The media has called the Amesbury Archer the King of Stonehenge, and he is possibly contemporary with the raising of the great Sarsen Stones, and he could have had enough clout to muster the enormous amount of labor required to build it, so maybe he did play some sort of role in it, but we just don't know, which is unbelievably frustrating to me. And it's still possible that he lived slightly later and was attracted to Britain because of Stonehenge's prior existence, but he certainly would have amazed any Neolithic farmer he met with his ability to work metal at will. Some have even said that it probably seemed like magic to them. So that raises a question which I genuinely think about quite a lot. How involved were the Beaker folk in the raising of the Sarsen Stones? They were pretty clearly involved in the last stages of Stonehenge's development. Between 2300 and 1900 BC, they rearranged the Bluestones into a bluestone horseshoe at the very center of Stonehenge and in a circle around the Sarsen horseshoe surrounding the Bluestone horseshoe. This might have been their way of co-opting the monument, since they did reuse and close off the megaliths of the Neolithic populations they replaced across Europe, most dramatically at West Kennet Long Barrow, where the Beaker people closed off the barrow with huge Sarsens. Later, and also at Stonehenge, they added the concentric circles of pits known as the Y and Z holes, anywhere between 2020 and 1450 BC, which might have been part of an abandoned attempt to install more stones or wooden posts at the monument. But why was there a quote-unquote explosion of construction activity, including Stonehenge, but also including other monuments nearby, like Silbury Hill and the ones at Avebury, as well as, of course, the henge earthworks at Durrington Walls, happening right when the Beaker people began to arrive in Britain around 2500 to 2300 BC? Sorry, that was a mouthful, but was this the Neolithic people's last desperate attempt at expressing their faith or the power of their rulers before they were wiped out? Or did Beaker elites like the Amesbury Archer help organize their construction? Horse bones from horses, possibly brought by the Beakers, were found at Durrington Walls, which, as you'll remember, was the village housing the people who built Stonehenge, but also, of course, the site of great feasts afterwards. And the Amesbury Archer might not even be the greatest of the early Bell Beaker folk buried near Stonehenge. Much closer to Stonehenge, flanking the main avenue to it, in fact, there's a series of huge, unexcavated round barrows, and they're called the King Barrows of King Barrow Ridge. So obviously I'm imagining that if we ever open any of them up, Conan the Barbarian will pop out. As early as the 17th century, they've been associated with kings, and as early as 1649, silver was reportedly taken from one. And more recent, limited storm damage surveys have recovered late Neolithic and early Bronze Age pottery from them. So maybe these hold the real kings of Stonehenge. The Beaker people were also obsessed with the sun and depicted it all the time in their art. So surely Stonehenge's alignment to the solstices was significant to them somehow. I mean, they even built something almost identical to it out of wood at Pamelt in central Germany. And that was definitely them. But even if we don't know how exactly involved the Beaker folk were with Stonehenge's construction, we do know that they were responsible for the closure of the monumental landscape around it. Around 1800 BC, they organized the division of that landscape into the sort of hedge and stone wall enclosed fields which you still find in Britain. While these field systems incorporated other henges, for some reason Stonehenge was given more respect and wasn't ever encroached upon. And even though the Beaker people preferred round barrows over communal long barrow funerary monuments, they often situated their barrows near older Neolithic monuments like Stonehenge. But all this change is most dramatically represented by the ominous graffiti depicting 116 bronze axe blades carved into the Sarsens of Stonehenge between 1750 and 1500 BC, which resemble this axe blade in the exhibit. They're called Ayrton Down axes because of this hoard found at a place called Ayrton Down all the way back in the 18th century. It's possible that the graffiti of them is meant to commemorate the deaths of the people buried in those round barrows. And at the very end of this exhibit are the spectacular treasures from these round barrows around Stonehenge, which were built by the people of the Wessex culture, the immediate descendants of the Beaker folk in southern England. So my little rant there should explain 4 different entries. The Amesbury Archer in level 2, and axes in Stonehenge in level 3, and 2 at the bottom of level 4, the one for King Barrow Ridge and the Beaker question. At first, this next case seemed to contain the treasures from the Bush Barrow, the richest and most famous of all the early Bronze Age round barrows at Normanton Down, which is right next to Stonehenge. But there's a catch. All of the big objects, like the gold lozenges and the dagger, are just replicas. But at the bottom of the case, there are actually a couple of tiny, almost invisible bits of the Bush Barrow burial. You can just barely see them, even behind the lens of this magnifying glass, and that's because they're 2 of the 138,000 little microscopic golden studs which once decorated the wooden hilt of a dagger similar to the replica just above them. Whoever wielded it in life must have had incomparable power. So that's the Bush Barrow in level 2. The very last case in the exhibit was truly astonishing to me because I've looked at a lot of pictures of the beautiful goldwork left by the descendants of the Beaker folk online, but this is the first time I've actually seen some in person, not counting that tiny bit of the Bush Barrow grave right beside it. These little treasures were found in another one of the Normanton Down round barrows referred to as Wilsford G8, which dates to around 1900 BC, so around when the bell beakers stopped being used. And it was excavated over 200 years ago by a guy named William Cunnington. It likely belonged to a high-status woman based on these dress ornaments, but again, it was excavated over 200 years ago, and the cremated remains found in the barrow are just gone, so who knows? But either way, the owner of this jewelry has been dubbed the Queen of Stonehenge, which is in layer 4 of the iceberg. There were a ton of spectacular objects crammed into this one case, including this little ceramic incense cup called the Stonehenge Cup, because of course it is, and because it's long been thought to have been deliberately made to look like Stonehenge. But apparently there are similar pots from northern France. I still think it's interesting that the rim has that cross-hatched roof-like design on it, though. It's possible that it was used to burn scented oil or even hemp at the burial ceremony, and that the clay in it may have even been fired on the cremation pyre of the deceased. There were also 2 beautiful gold discs, likely earrings decorated with the same concentric circles you see time and time again on European Bronze Age goldwork, which have to represent the sun, right? In fact, Bronze Age Europeans probably loved gold so much because it reminded them of the sun. Interestingly, these gold discs encase amber, visible at their centers, and more amber objects, not displayed here, were found in the Queen of Stonehenge's barrow. These bits of amber probably came all the way from the Baltic, so just imagine the crazy journeys they witnessed. These strange little cones made of gold and shale, again featuring the same incised linear decoration Bronze Age Europeans loved, were probably either used as pendants or as buttons used to fasten cloaks. Also, I didn't know this when I was recording, but this odd little checkered rectangular piece I didn't get any good footage of is actually a piece of skull, either from a sheep or even a human covered in a layer of gold. It seems to have been worn by the barrow's occupant in life as a pendant for whatever reason, and there was this gold-covered bronze ring which clearly resembled bull's horns, which made me wonder what role cows had in the religion of these people. And finally, there's another little pendant representing a miniature halberd with an amber handle wrapped in gold strips holding a tiny broken copper blade, which I found the most interesting of all these things. Overall, It was a great exhibit. And that's the end of the video. I'd like to thank my patrons, my good friend Drew Singal, Booga420, Bajun, Julia Erickson, Harrison Timperley, Doc Bossman, Kevin Ryan, Ayanami Amamami, Bomb Tombadil, Danny Banani, Rose Klein, James Kirk, Alyssa P, Mark Elliott Cullen, Shemek Wersbitsky, Jack Lester, Mithridates, Jake the Snake, Liv Buller, Tyler Doucette, Inbred Cat, Have a Cigar, Alex Clark, Jess Sullivan, Akune, and my newest patrons, John Ballard, Giovanna Lazzarini, and our old friend Miha Nidog.